Hey, I'm Jesse. Let's have a devotion. We're going to look at Ezekiel chapter 42, verses 1 through 14. Here's the text. Then the man led me out by way of the north gate into the outer court. He brought me to the group of chambers opposite the temple yard and opposite the building to the north. Along the length of the chambers, which was 175 feet, there was an entrance on the north. The width was 87.5 feet. Opposite the 35-foot space belonging to the inner court and opposite the paved surface belonging to the outer court, the structure rose gallery by gallery in 3 tiers. In front of the chambers was a walkway toward the inside, 17.5 feet wide and 175 feet long, and their entrances were on the north. The upper chambers were narrower because the galleries took away more space from them than the lower and middle stories of the building, for they were arranged in 3 stories and had no pillars like the pillars of the courts. Therefore, the upper chambers were set back from the ground more than the lower and middle stories. A wall on the outside ran in front of the chambers parallel to them toward the outer court. It was 87.5 feet long. For the chambers in the outer court were 87.5 feet long, while those facing the great hall were 175 feet long. At the base of these chambers, there was an entryway on the east side as one enters them from the outer court. In the thickness of the wall of the court toward the south, there were chambers facing the temple yard and the western building with a passageway in front of them, just like the chambers that faced north. Their length and width, as well as their exits, measurements, and entrances were identical. The entrance at the beginning of the passageway, the way in front of the corresponding wall as one enters on the east side, was similar to the entrances of the chambers that were on the south side. Then the man said to me, "The northern and southern chambers that face the courtyard are the holy chambers where the priests who approach the Lord will eat the most holy offerings." So we've finally seen some of these rooms revealed and what their purpose is. So we know that there are these priests, these descendants from Zadok, for example, the priest who was faithful to both David and his son Solomon at the beginning of the first temple. Now those descendants are serving Jesus in his second coming, reigning in Jerusalem for 1,000 years in this temple. There is this sacrificial system that is commemorative in nature, meaning these are not Old Testament sacrifices. These are more akin to communion, the way that we eat and drink in remembrance of what Christ did. These sacrifices are carried out in remembrance of what Christ did. And so part of that sacrificial system included a way to provide for the Levites. When the sacrifice was made, the meat was to be consumed by the priests. Their provision then was from the worship of the Lord. That's why the Levites didn't have a particular allocation in the promised land. They had, Jerusalem. And they also had other temples, spaces set up throughout the tribal allotments in the Holy Land. We saw this in our study of the book of Joshua. Strength and Courage is the title of that series. But what's so cool to me is that thousands of years later, the descendants are now serving that same role again, but now it's a New Testament iteration. While it's a New Testament iteration, this is still happening while people like you and me are flesh and bone. So we haven't yet been glorified, which means that these descendants of the priestly line have not yet been glorified. And wait a minute, Jesse, I thought that no man could see God and live. All right, what was that whole story in Exodus where Moses goes up to the mountain and he can only survive a glimpse of the train of God's robe while he passes by, and even then God is protecting him from his own holiness with his hand, concealing himself, hiding Moses in the cleft of a rock even, and then his face glowed, even from that brief glimpse. So how is it that these mere men are able to see Jesus? The same way that the disciples saw Jesus. Same way that Judas saw Jesus. The same way that Pontius Pilate saw Jesus, and Caiaphas and Nicodemus. Same way that Mary saw Jesus. The same way that everyone who ever saw Jesus in his first ministry, we too, and by we, I mean people like you and me, who live in the millennial kingdom, will see Jesus. So they're in the direct presence of God himself. It's the resurrected Jesus returned to the earth. And they're carrying out this priestly new iteration in a New Testament sense. But because they're living, breathing mortals just like you and me, they still haven't been glorified. Now, check out the provisions that are made for these mere mortal priests. There they will deposit the most holy offerings, the grain offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings, for the place is holy. Once the priests have entered the tent, they are not to go out from the holy area to the outer court until they have removed the clothes they minister in, for these are holy. They are to put on other clothes before they approach the public area. So they change their clothes when they enter the holy place. And when they go to eat the meat from the meat offerings that are made, or the grain offerings, the guilt offerings, like they're to change clothes before they go into the public area. They're still mortal men. They're in the direct presence of Jesus right there in the temple as he reigns for 1,000 years, but they still are waiting for the new heaven and the new earth. Remember, again, this is the temple from which Jesus will reign for 1,000 years. This is not the heavenly city. That comes in Revelation. You could think of this as like the last church building, really. All right, it's the last one we'll ever really need. It's Jesus's temple, and it's tended to by priests. The clothing is what's particularly named. The clothes they minister in are holy. Okay, they themselves need to change before they approach the public area. Why the clothing? What about the ceremonial washings that were prescribed for the Levitical priesthood? For that matter, I mean, I've even taught this before when I taught through Numbers and Deuteronomy. That series is titled Shadows in the Sand. You see the invention of laundry detergent. You know, like when a priest would sin, when he had to atone for his own sin, he would dip his priestly robes into ashen water mixed with the fat of a bull. I mean, that's lye and phosphorus. That's soap. That's like gain. That's like Old Testament Tide, thousands of years before soap was properly invented. From the same ingredients, by the way. Those things are still on modern day laundry detergent today. Seems like the weirdest thing, like the bull's dung and the wood ash and the fat. And it's like, it sounds gross, but it's actually, when all that stuff is heated and combined and rendered, it produces soap. It was really just a washing of the robe that carried spiritual significance as well. It's amazing how many of those Old Testament laws that seem obscure actually served hygienic purposes. And they were way before any notion of our field of microbiology. That wouldn't even exist until after Darwin's time, by the way. So these guys have priestly duties, and they have clothing that they are to change out of before they go to the public area. The clothing, I think it reminds us of this teaching from 1 Corinthians 15. Someone will ask, how are the dead raised? What kind of body will they have when they come? You fool, Paul writes. We taught this in our series, Into the Fray, if you want more on this. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And as for what you sow, you're not sowing the body that will be, but only a seed, perhaps of wheat or another grain. But God gives it a body as he wants, and to each of the seeds its own body. Not all flesh is the same flesh. There is one flesh for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the splendor of the heavenly bodies is different from that of the earthly ones. There's a splendor of the sun, another of the moon, and another of the stars. In fact, one star differs from another star in splendor. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. Sown in corruption, raised in incorruption. Sown in dishonor, raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power. Ooh. Sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. If there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. So it is written. I think he's quoting Genesis 2:7 here. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. Okay, this right here totally does away with pagan teachings that we are disembodied souls who come to earth later. Okay, my Mormon friend, do you read that? That's 1 Corinthians 15:46. Okay, if you got your theology from that Disney movie, was it with Jamie Foxx and Tina Fey? I forget what it was called, but no, we don't exist before. Okay, it's clear. The physical comes first, then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. Like the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. Like the man of heaven, so are those who are of heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we will also bear the image of the man of heaven. You see, it describes that which is perishable, longing to be clothed with the imperishable. And so these priests in these rooms that surround the temple in the millennium, they have to change clothes because they're ministering in perishable bodies next to the one who has perished and resurrected. They currently bear the image of the first man, but they'll look like him before long. And you and I, likewise, we cannot enter the presence of the Father. We would die. The presence of his holiness is too much for sinful people like us. Isaiah had a glimpse of him and said, "Woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the glory of God." But these priests are able to see Jesus. The world's able to see Jesus. And not everybody's going to believe him. They'll look at him and not believe. They'll see and not perceive. They'll hear and not understand. They will have hard hearts and they will not believe. Otherwise, they would see and perceive. They would hear and understand. They would believe and repent and be saved. So these priests fascinate me. And these rooms where they have to go to consume the offerings that are their provisions, similar to the way that they were in the Old Testament for their deep ancestors in the Levitical priesthood. They're there next to Jesus while he is reigning for 1,000 years, and they still have to make provision because the clothes that they wear when they perform their priestly duties are holy, and they will one day be made holy. Those whom God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those he justified, he also glorified. So God knew you before the foundations of the earth, and it was predetermined that those he foreknew would be conformed to the image of Jesus. And so we're in the process of being sanctified right now, hopefully, day after day. But one day there's glorification, and then you won't need to change clothes. There will be no need. You can be in the direct presence of God forever. You can look at him like Moses could not. He will be with us, and we will be with him. The dwelling of God will be with men. That is the new heaven, the new earth. And there's not even need for a temple there. That's the ultimate ending. This is what precedes that. This is the millennial temple. And I covet that role. Man, to serve Jesus directly in his temple like that. I don't care how many wardrobe changes are required. That's incredible to see. And it speaks as well to the office of pastor. He is the chief shepherd, and we are the under shepherds. And when he comes, as Peter writes, it looks like this. So in the meantime, we are the temple. May Jesus reign in our hearts. Right now we live in the perishable, resembling Adam, but one day we'll be conformed to the likeness of Christ. And in the intervening time, this is the redemptive plan for all of fallen humanity. It culminates in the new heaven and the new earth, and that ultimate victory and redemption is preceded by this Edenic glimpse, Christ himself reigning. That's going to be amazing. Okay, if you're a pastor looking for a job, ask God if somehow you can have one of these gigs, because that's pretty amazing.